Narrative has become increasingly important in games as time has gone on. But though the state of video game storytelling is stronger than it has ever been, some games still fumble with it every now and then. That hurts more than most with games that are otherwise excellent, games that, from a gameplay perspective, are among the very best their respective genres have to offer, but faltering within their storytelling. In this feature, we'll be taking a look at such games. Metal Gear Solid 5. It's heartbreaking that a Metal Gear Solid game has to be the one that kicks off a list about disappointing stories, but that's just the way it is. The Phantom Pain is a masterclass in emergent, system-based gameplay with stealth mechanics that stand at the very best even to this day. But it's a game that sheds the story-heavy focus that the series was always known for. Cutscenes are few and far between, while some of the most important storytelling bits are relegated to optional cassette tapes and missable events. Don't even get us started on that ending. The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild. But while it's a masterpiece in terms of emergent gameplay and open world design, story and storytelling are two areas where Breath of the Wild is at its weakest. It never quite maximizes the potential of its interesting post-apocalyptic setting, while characters are also never developed quite as much as we would have liked. The game also hints at some very interesting lore, but never really does much with it. It's a story, in the end, that has a lot of potential, but sadly enough, it never meets that potential. Killzone 3. Until 2017's Horizon Zero Dawn, Guerrilla Games weren't really known for being very good storytellers. But of all of the disappointing tales that they had put out until that time, Killzone 3 is perhaps the most disappointing. Its setting saw its protagonist stranded on a hospitable and harsh planet, surrounded by deadly enemies with next to no backup. It was a setting that they could have done a lot with, while seeing how the Helghast regroup after Visari's death was also something that could have been very interesting. Sadly, Killzone 3, much like its predecessors, squanders the potential of its narrative setup. Dishonored 2. Dishonored 2 doesn't really have a bad story per se. Much like its predecessor, it had an excellent and richly realized setting, but unlike its predecessor, this was a game that was building off of a foundation rather than having to lay one down, and as such, could and should have done a lot more with it. It was, unlike the rest of the game, largely conservative and unimaginative, and we're sure we're not the only ones who would have wanted a story that could stand toe-to-toe with its excellent gameplay. STARCRAFT 2: Heart of the Swarm. STARCRAFT 2 is probably, at least at this point, one of the best RTS titles to have come out in the last decade, but when it first launched, its narrative was among the things fans found the most disappointing. Heart of the Swarm, its expansion, was something that fans thought would address their concerns, but sadly enough, that turned out to not be the case. To be fair, Legacy of the Void would go on to make up for a lot of the issues that had been brought up with its predecessor, but the disappointment we all felt with Heart of the Swarm and its story is something that we still have not forgotten. Final Fantasy 15. Final Fantasy as a series has always banked on story more than anything else, so expectations from the long-awaited Final Fantasy 15 were high in this area. And while Final Fantasy 15 is a great game by and large, its story is sourly disappointing, most importantly because Square Enix, in all of their wisdom, decided to only let the game tell half of it. Some of the most interesting and important events aren't even shown in the game, and unless you've seen Kingsglaive or Brotherhood, some of the most significant narrative events will be completely lost on you. That said, at least the game does justice to 4 main characters, if nothing else. Just Cause 2. Just Cause 2's chaotic, destruction-fueled gameplay was something that was praised by one and all back in 2010 when the game first came out. But equally universal was criticism for the game's narrative. With subpar writing, laughably bad voice acting, terrible cutscenes, and a plot that was way too willing to throw all logic out the window, it was a game that might as well have not even tried to have a story. That said, Just Cause has never really been a series that cares much about its narrative, so this one is slightly easier to forgive than many of the other games on this list. Pokémon X and Y. Pokémon games often stumble when it comes to their stories, but X and Y are perhaps the biggest offenders in this area. Not only did they come off of the back of Black and White, which has perhaps the best story in a Pokémon game ever, it also hints at some very strong lore and backstory without ever really doing much with it. A larger focus on the historic events of the Pokémon War and on AZ would surely have elevated the game's narrative to a whole new level. Ace Combat Assault Horizon. Ace Combat Assault Horizon is a divisive game for many reasons, but the one aspect of the entire experience that is more disappointing than anything else is its story. Ace Combat games, at least the mainline ones, always manage to tell captivating stories, at least to some extent, but Assault Horizon completely failed in this area. By virtue of being a non-numbered spin-off entry, expectations from Assault Horizon were obviously lower than usual, but no one could have imagined that it would fail to live up to even those expectations. DISGAEA 5. As far as the actual gameplay is concerned, DISGAEA 5 is an absolute blast. It's got excellent combat and incredibly deep systems to lose yourself in, but the plot completely lets the entire game down. It's full of tropes and predictable twists and turns, and lacks any sense of good pacing whatsoever, with events and scenarios that drag on for way longer than they should. Not to mention the fact that almost every character in the game is the most generic anime character you will ever see. Fallout 4. In a bid to become more streamlined, Fallout 4 lost much of what made Fallout 3 so good. The dialogue choices felt neutered and lacking in depth, which inherently made the story harder to invest in. The story itself wasn't anything special either. It wasn't bad, sure, but ultimately failed to do anything that would make it stand out. Thankfully, there were plenty of characters in the game that did manage to make a mark, but even most of those were part of side stories and optional quest lines. Borderlands 2. Borderlands 2's narrative is, to be fair, a step up over its predecessor, but it still doesn't quite hit the heights that it surely could. It's got great humorous writing and some memorable characters, but the story itself doesn't do anything that can help it stand out. The focus here is of course on loot, grinding, co-op gameplay, and progression, so its shortcomings in the narrative department are easier to forgive, but we're hoping Borderlands 3, if and when it comes out, will make some much needed improvements in this area. Destiny. By virtue of being a shared world co-op shooter, Destiny was never going to have the same focus on story, but even with relatively lowered expectations, Destiny's story, especially before the Taken King rolled out, proved to be a disappointment. The game constantly hinted at engaging and complex lore, but it never did much with it, relegating some of the most interesting tidbits to its grimoire cards. Octopath Traveler. Octopath Traveler has a lot going for it. A beautiful visual style, an addictive and complex battle system, a long campaign that keeps you busy for nearly 100 hours. The one area where it's completely lacking, however, is its story. None of the 8 characters manage to stand out, while the fact that each of them go through their own stories without ever really interacting with anyone else also completely wastes the potential of having 8 main characters to begin with. There's also the fact that the start-stop manner in which the entire game is structured completely ruins its pacing. And that about does it for this video. If you enjoyed what you watched and want to see more from GamingBolt, you can always hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell icon next to it. That way you will never miss any of our videos.